There are moments in our lives when we really can get glimpses into just the majesty of God. I was 16 the first time I saw the ocean. And I remember we pulled into our hotel in Hilton Head, South Carolina, got out of the car, didn't unpack anything, didn't go into the hotel, just got out, walked straight out onto the beach just to see it. And I remember just being overwhelmed by it. And I've never really gotten over the ocean. When we lived in South Carolina, we loved going to the beach on the weekends. And I would often find myself just standing there in the water as the tide would come up and wash over my feet before retreating back into the ocean. And I'm just standing there, just looking out, water as far as I can see until eventually the horizon just takes it out of your view. Just overwhelmed at the vastness and the expanse of the ocean. It's so big. Like there's no way to truly just like grasp how big what you're looking at truly is. And then several years ago, I think it was 2018, we went on a cruise. And when we went on a cruise, after we pulled out of the Gulf and then we got out into the open ocean, that gave me a different perspective of the ocean. See, when I'm standing on the beach, I can look to my right and I can look to my left and I can see land. And then water is just that way, right? When you're on a cruise and you're out in the middle of the ocean, it doesn't matter which direction you look. It is just water everywhere as far as you can see. And it makes you feel so small, like you could just be swallowed up by the ocean and no one would ever know. Because it's just so big and so massive, it makes you feel that small. Several years ago, I was on a church planting mission trip in Las Vegas. We went out to help with a church that was getting started up there, and we did a lot of work, but one day we had a free day. And so we decided that we were going to go hike Red Rock Canyon. So we went and hiked Red Rock Canyon. It was called Turtle Heads Peak was the trail we did, and we went up to Turtle Heads Peak, and I remember getting up to the top and just being like having that same feeling, just being overwhelmed at the mountains and the desert that we were completely surrounded by. Just a few weeks ago, my family, we were in Gatlinburg. And we ate at this restaurant up at the top of this new place called Anakista, and there was this restaurant there, and the table we got to sit in was right up against the ledge, and so right behind me, overlooking was the overlook was of just all these mountains. And much like the ocean and the desert, you could just find yourself lost in the wonder of these tree-covered mountains as far as the eye can see. And it's in moments like that, when you're just confronted with how big the world is, that for someone who recognizes and knows God, it really puts into perspective how big and how great God is, and how small you are in comparison and in the grand scheme of things. Now, occasionally, we get glimpses like that of God in Scripture as well, and today is going to be one of those. But I think when we see things like this in Scripture, one I think of is the Exodus, when God split the Red Sea. I mean, can you imagine being there? That you're standing there in front of this sea, and then out of nowhere, God splits it, and then you get to walk across on dry land, and there's just walls of water on each side of you. Now, I stand and just stare at the ocean. Somebody would have had to like push me along because I'm just going to be staring at these walls of water that are standing still, walking across. Like I would have stood and stared at that forever. I would have touched the wall, like stick my just to see what happens. Like, can I grab a fish out of there? Can I fish through this? Like, what was that like? But today we're going to see something similar, and we're going to see the greatness of God. We're going to look at a specific text that gives us this big and grand and majestic picture of God if we see it for what it is truly saying, and we get to see how truly powerful He is. Then this particular text, we're going to see that Jesus is Lord over creation when He calms the storm. Now, one thing I think about this is I think this is one of those stories in the Bible, and one of those stories of Jesus, that we can really miss what I think the Bible is actually trying to teach us. When we read this story, I think there can be a tendency or a temptation to just immediately run to, what does this mean for me? How is God going to calm the storms in my life? Now, if we immediately run to what this means for us, we miss it. we must first primarily see what this is telling us about Jesus, uncover what it's saying about him, because only by discovering what this says about Jesus can we truly and rightly understand what it means for us. So we're going to look at Jesus as he calms the storm. And this story today, this is going to be an eye-opening experience for the disciples. They're going to get to see Jesus in a way that they have never seen him before. And I pray it will be the same kind of experience for us, that we will get to see Jesus in a new way, get to see him in a powerful way, and that it grows our confidence and our trust in him as we see the Lord move and work in this today. So we're going to start in Mark chapter 4, verse 35. But before we go to the Lord, before we open the word, let's go to the Lord in prayer. God, as we open your word today, Lord, it's good to be back with Grace Church family and back into the book of Mark, Lord. I feel like we have a church have grown so much through this as we've seen the growth and just the progression of the ministry of Jesus. God, we've got to see him work in just these few short chapters. And God, as we see him today in a new way and in a fresh way, Lord, I pray that it would certainly grow our confidence and our trust in him. I want to see your name we pray. Amen. So beginning in verse 35, this is picking up after a long day of teaching. Jesus, he would have been tired. We're going to see that he was tired. At this moment, he's probably already standing in the boat. Crowds would come to see Jesus speak all the time, that the only way that he could speak and for everyone to hear him was he would put himself in a little boat, go out into the water just a little bit, and then speak back to all the people standing on the coast. So Jesus is probably already teaching. He's already standing in the boat. And then we pick up in verse 35. And it says, on that day when evening had come, he said to them, let us go across to the other side. And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat just as he was, and other boats were with him. So they get in the boat. The disciples here, they get in the boat. They depart with Jesus. Now, several of them were fishermen. This would have been part of their normal thing. They're comfortable in boats. They know the Sea of Galilee. This is where Jesus called the first disciples. This is where they work. This is where they fish. Like this is their stomping ground. The disciples are very comfortable here. They know what to do. They know how to sail the boat. They know how to row the boat. They know how to look for the conditions on the sea. They know what time of day is usually best. They know what they're doing here. These aren't amateurs. They're not rookies. These are professionals. And so they get in the boat and they go across to the other side like Jesus told them. But then in verse 37, it says, and a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat so that the boat was already filling. So this storm starts, and it immediately starts throwing water into this boat, just out of nowhere. Here's the thing. These types of storms, they're typical of the Sea of Galilee. Here's the Sea of Galilee. I got a picture of it for you. So in this picture, you can see this. You can see the sea. It's essentially a very large freshwater lake is what the Sea of Galilee is. Now you can see it's surrounded on all sides by these mountains and these cliffs. The Sea of Galilee sits at about 700 feet below sea level. So what would happen is as the wind comes and it cuts across the land, it would crest right over top of those cliffs, swoop down into that bowl effect that's created here, and then it would go in and it would churn up all the water and create these huge windstorms. So it would go down, disrupt the water, create these large waves, and immediately disrupt the water. Still happens today. There's restaurants right around the Sea of Galilee where they will tell you not to park your car because if one of these storms hit, you're not going to be able to get it out. The restaurants are on stilts, much like you'll see on beaches around here. Because these windstorms can happen so quick and so violently that there's not a whole lot of warning. That wind just comes across, swoops down, and disrupts everything. And as this boat is starting to fill up, the story tells us that the waves, that they were big enough. So they would have been white capping. They're coming over into the boat. And this wouldn't have been a very big boat. It would have been about 25 to 28 feet long, about 7 feet wide. So big enough for all 13 of them, the 12 disciples and Jesus, but they wouldn't have had a ton of room. One thing that's really cool is in 1986, there was a drought in the Sea of Galilee. And the water levels got so low that one of these boats was actually revealed. This is what they found in 1986, was the remains of this boat. This would have been incredibly similar to the boat Jesus is riding in this story, more than likely. They dated this boat, and it dated back to the 1st century. So this boat dated back to the time when much of the New Testament was being written. So we have this picture now of this boat that Jesus and the disciples would have been riding in here. And so these waves, you can see how big the boat is. It's not a huge boat, but the waves would have been big enough at least to be threatening. They would have been big enough to be coming into the water, and you can imagine the fear and the anxiety that's produced by this storm as the waves start filling up and rocking your boat. When waves bigger than your boat are tossing you around, you're going to be fearful when you're out in the middle of a giant sea. And so that's what happens. The disciples immediately, they start panic. I can imagine some of the disciples just like they knew what they were doing. And so in a boat like this, there would have been a sail and usually about 4 oars. So I can imagine you have 4 disciples just on the oars, just trying to row, trying to keep the direction of the boat into the waves to keep it from capsizing. And then you've probably got another 1 or 2 disciples back there on the rudder trying to steer just to keep this thing going. Then some other disciples, they're filling up buckets of water, trying to throw the water out. And then you got others who are trying to throw stuff out of the boat so that they can lighten the load so it's easier to manage. And then Levi, he was a tax collector, so he wasn't experienced in this thing. So he's probably throwing up off the side of the boat, and they're just doing everything that they can to keep this boat from capsizing. They were in an absolute panic because if this boat tips over, they have no chance to swim out of these conditions. They are literally in a life or death situation where they were trying to keep this boat upright. And what is Jesus doing? Look in verse 38. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. The stern is the back of the boat. Must have been a purple. I mean, those cushions are super soft. I love those. One of these days, I hope to have a purple mattress. We'll see, This must have been a really nice cushion. But Jesus, he was tired, right? He all day teaching, all day like doing miracles. He was tired. And here he is asleep in the boat, and everybody else around him is panicking. All this commotion, and he's out. A few months ago, we were having some work done on our house, and we were having new floors put in. When we bought our house, it's a very typical house, not a big house, typical bi-level for this area, nothing special. But when we got in there, we had 3 different floors. We had tile in our dining room, hardware laminate in our kitchen, and then we had carpet going down the hallway in our living room. So if I stood in the same spot and I put my foot like that, I could be standing on 3 different types of floors at the same time. And so one of the things we're like, we want to get all the same floors in our house. And so eventually we bit the bullet and we did it. And about 8:30 a.m., this crew of 4 guys, they show up to start working. As soon as they come in through our door, 2 minutes into our door, they're already going at it. They wasted no time whatsoever. And so the first thing they go to is they go straight to the tile. One of them's on the hammer. One of them's got a hammer. He's breaking up the tile. Then you got this other guy with this large scraper, and he's scraping it, and it is loud. And then you got the other one who's ripping up the laminate in the kitchen, and they're playing their radio, and they're talking, and they're yelling back and forth. And then they start ripping up the carpet, which goes down the hallway right to where all of our bedroom doors are. Like I said, not a big house. Where the tile's being torn up is probably 15 to 20 feet from my son's bedroom, okay? So they got their music. It's loud. Some days, Amy and I were blessed enough that we get to work from home on the same days. I think this was a Monday, which was one of those days. And so we were like, this is too loud. We cannot work in here. We're going to go sit outside on our back porch. So we sit outside on our back porch because it was so loud in that house. Just what they were breaking and tearing up the tile and scraping, ripping up the carpet, snapping the laminate as it was coming up. Like, they were not trying to be quiet at all. They did not respect the fact that we were trying to get some work done. And so they're there for about 2 hours. And then 2 hours later, one of the guys is ripping up carpet, and he looks up in shock. Because after working for 2 hours, my son opens his bedroom door and stumbles out, rubbing his eyes. And the guy's like, there's a kid in there? He's been asleep this whole time? Like, yes, he's been sleeping this whole time. This kid, he can sleep through anything. He was out, right? Jesus was essentially doing the same thing. Jesus was out. Now, I think Jesus sleeping on the back of this boat in the midst of the storm with everybody around him panicking is a little more impressive than my son sleeping through some floor construction. But why could Jesus sleep? How is Jesus asleep in this? Because Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus, he wasn't surprised by this storm. He wasn't afraid of this storm. There was no reason that Jesus couldn't rest because he knew this storm was coming. The waves are crashing all around him, yet here Jesus is asleep. He was able to sleep because he was confident in who he was, and he knew he had all of these circumstances in his hand. Now, I imagine the disciples, as Jesus is sleeping, they're on the oars, they're throwing water out with buckets, they're trying to chuck stuff over the side. Matt, Levi's still over there throwing up, and they're trying to figure this whole thing out. How are we going to keep this boat open? They're panicking, they're doing everything they possibly can, and occasionally they look back over their shoulder and they see Jesus is still sleeping, and they're like, how is he sleeping? I can imagine some of them were having a conversation. How is he sleeping through this? And then some of them, then they start to get a little unrestful. They start to get a little upset at Jesus. We're doing all of this. He's sleeping. He's not even helping us. And they're going through all of this panic, trying to keep this boat upright, trying to keep it from tipping over, trying to stay alive. And eventually they have enough. So they go over to Jesus and they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Do you not care?" This is an admonishment. They are not pleased with Jesus in the moment. They are talking to Jesus in a way that when you read it, you're like, are we allowed to talk to Jesus like that? Like, that's the way that they are addressing him right now. They were at a point where fear had gripped them. They had no options left. So they woke him up. And in my mind, I imagine Jesus wakes up the way that, like, if I ever take a nap on a couch, my dog, he comes straight to me and just puts his toy, like, right up against my nose to wake me up, like I'm ready to play now. I imagine Jesus looked at the disciples the way that I look at my dog, like, why are you waking me up right now? I was in the middle of a really good nap, I imagine that's the way that Jesus woke up. And then, so Jesus wakes up, and then he stands up, and it says he rebuked the wind. To rebuke something, it is a stern admonishment, or it is a stern condemnation. It's the same way that Jesus would speak to demonic spirits who were possessing people. He would rebuke the spirits and command them what to do. And that's the way that he talks to this storm. And so I imagine Jesus wakes up, they're all losing their minds. Matthew's throwing up. Jesus stands up, stretches, gives a yawn, a little frustrated at the disciples, and he gives it the dad voice. He gives the storm the dad voice. Peace, be still. And immediately everything stops. And grammatically, this is something that's called a present active imperative. Big word really means one thing. It means listen and keep listening. So telling you to do one thing, and I'm giving you this command, but this command isn't just for one time, but it's continue doing this. Essentially, what Jesus just did here was he told the storm to sit down, shut up, and stay quiet. He put the storm in timeout. That's what Jesus did here. He said, sit down, shut up, stay quiet, and remain quiet. And what happened? It listened. This is authority. What's fascinating about this part is when Jesus rebuked the wind, it didn't take any time for the waves to stop. If you've ever been out on a lake or an ocean or anything like that, whenever the wind just ceases, it still takes a little time for all those waves to calm down because that water's still moving. But immediately, wind stopped, water's calm, peace, be still now. That is authority, and that gives us a glimpse into the reality of who Jesus is. So then he turns to his disciples, who I imagine at this point just look a mess. Whenever you see movies or pictures of the disciples, they're all like 40 with long scraggly hair and beards. They were likely teenagers, but just for our image, because that's usually how we think about them, they never look clean to begin with. and the pictures that we see of them. So you can imagine what they look like now, right? Just long, stringy hair, just soaked, some of it like down over their faces. Their beards are all messed up. Their clothes are soaked. Matthew's got puke all over him. Like they're trying to throw stuff out. They are looking disheveled. Some of their shirts are probably ripped, just falling off. They thought they were goners. They're standing there with their buckets, just still, that just happened. Just in total amazement and astonishment. And Jesus looks at them, and he says to them, "Why are you so afraid?" That seems like an unreasonable question, right? Wouldn't it be reasonable for them to be afraid in this moment? It seems like the expectation would be anybody who thinks their boat is about to go down in the middle of a storm, they have right to fear. Right? But when Jesus asks that question, what it does is it reveals his expectation of them was that they shouldn't have been afraid. And he shows that in the next verse, or in the second part of that verse, because the next question he asks shows why he had that expectation. Have you still no faith? Do you still lack faith? Faith in what? Faith in him. Faith, having a knowledge of him that leads to a faith that recognizes that the one who has all authority is in the boat with you. You still don't have the faith that I have all of this under my command. Have you still no faith? And their response is given in verse 41. And they were filled with a great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So now they have a different fear. This is a different kind of fear than the fear they were experiencing just moments ago. Just moments ago, they were losing their minds. They were panicking because they thought they were about to die. They were scared for their lives. But now they have this reverential fear. This astonishment. They're awestruck at the power they are in the presence of. Imagine if you were out on a hike somewhere in the Northwest and you come across a mountain lion. What are you going to be? You should be scared. If you don't answer scared, you're going to die. Like you're done. Sorry about you. That mountain lion is faster than you, stronger than you. It's dangerous. If you don't have a gun, good luck, So you imagine you see this mountain lion out in the Northwest and you come across it and you just stop, stuck in your tracks. You don't want to approach it. You know not to run because this thing's faster than you, but then it just slowly starts creeping towards you. Just that prowl walk, that those cats have. And it starts coming to you. And so then you panic and you run. And then this bobcat is coming and it's gaining on you because it's faster than everybody in this room. And it's coming and it's coming. And right when it pounces and it's about to get you out of nowhere, a grizzly bear comes, snatches it midair, saves you from the bobcat. Bobcat's gone. But now you're in the presence of a massive, powerful, huge, giant grizzly bear that just ate a bobcat, ate a mountain lion, right? What initially threatened you in the first place, that threat is gone. But now what you are standing before is more powerful than what threatened you to begin with. This is what the disciples are standing before. They were about to lose their lives in the storm, and now they are standing before something more powerful than the storm, something that commanded the storm to sit down, shut up, and be quiet, and the storm listened. That is authority. That is the fear that they have. They feared the storm. But Jesus spoke to the storm, and the storm listened, and they said, "Who then is this that even the wind and the storms obey him?" And that question is telling, because what that question does for us is that lets us know that the disciples, they still didn't fully understand who Jesus was. They trusted him to a point, right? They're following him. They got in this boat and they went with him. They're following him around. They've chosen to follow him as a disciple. But they don't have a full grasp on how powerful he is. And that's kind of what the book of Mark is about. It is this progressive revelation where Jesus reveals more and more of himself to us. Just like he's doing with the disciples, he's revealing more and more of himself to the disciples until eventually they get a grasp on who he is after his death and his resurrection. And as we do the same thing, as we start to understand more of who he is, he becomes increasingly the Lord of our lives. And that leads us to our first principle for today, that our knowledge of God fuels our faith in God. Our knowledge of God fuels our faith in God. As we grow in our knowledge of him and we grow in our faith and our trust, we will grow in our faith and trust in him. So our knowledge of him grows our faith and our trust. That's what happened to the disciples. They spent time with Jesus. And as they spent time with Jesus, what do you think they did? They got to know Jesus. And Jesus revealed more of himself to them. And as that occurred, they grew in their knowledge, which ultimately led to greater faith and trust in who he was. But along with that, spending that time with Jesus, it gave them relational experience with him. They understood what it meant then to have a relationship with Jesus. And the same is true for us. We must spend time with Jesus. When we spend time in his word, when we spend time in prayer, when we cultivate relationships with people who are going to encourage us to grow in our walk with him, when we spend time in grace groups and we spend time in Aspire, those are all avenues in which we invite God to speak into our lives. And as he does, our faith and trust in him increases. Now, it is important that we talk about what kind of knowledge that I'm talking about here. I don't just mean an intellectual recognition of the existence of God or a God, but it is a knowledge in which you recognize Jesus as the Lord of your life. John Wesley, he said this. So there's a difference between having an opinion that God is holy and gracious and having a sense of the loveliness and beauty of that holiness and grace. There is a difference between having a rational judgment that honey is sweet and having a sense of its sweetness because you have tasted it. It's one thing to know about God. It's something entirely different to know him. My dream vacation is to go out west, like Yellowstone, Yosemite, Yukon, all the way down to the Grand Canyon. I want to see those places. I've seen pictures and I just want to go. I've never been, but because I've seen pictures that give me a glimpse of the beauty, I can explain I can explain what's there. I can talk to you about the Mirror Lakes and how they reflect the snow-capped mountains. I want to see it. I can tell you about the lush forests, and I can imagine the Colorado River just cutting through hundreds of miles of undisturbed rock at the Grand Canyon. I can tell you about those things. Do you know what I can't do? I can't recall what the wind coming off of Lake Tahoe feels like when it hits your skin. I can't recall the crisp air that fills your lungs coming out of Glacier National Park. I can't tell you what it feels like to sit and watch a sunrise at the Grand Canyon or a sunset. You know why? Because I've never experienced those things. I've never gone through them. That's not something that I've got experience doing. Much like someone who knows about God, they might know about him. They might have some sort of understanding. They may even recognize that he is real. But without a relationship, without experience with God, you have knowledge, but you have no faith. And what Jesus is calling the disciples to here, what he's calling us to through this story is greater faith, not to have a stronger faith, but to understand that the object of our faith cannot fail. It's that knowledge of God. Proverbs 19 says it like this: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is insight. It is a knowledge of God that begins with a fear of God because you recognize who he is and you respond rightly. And there is only one way to properly respond to who God is, and that is in surrender. It is total worship and reverential fear. And that's what the disciples just came face to face with. When we have a knowledge that fuels our faith in God, we can then take confidence that the Lord of creation is the author of our circumstances. The Lord of creation is author of our circumstances. Notice here how Jesus said in verse 35, "Let us go across to the other side." That's all he said. Said, let us go across to the other side. He doesn't explain to them what they're doing. He doesn't say, hey, we have to go over there. There's some miracles I want to perform over there. There's a sick person. I'm going to go over there and heal. He just says, let us go across to the other side, because he knows something is about to happen. I fully believe Jesus knew a storm was coming. He says, let us go across to the other side, and he knew a storm was coming. Part of this text, what Jesus is doing is he is putting the disciples in a situation that will lead to circumstances that will create a greater knowledge of who he is. I think Jesus fully understands and knows what he's doing here. He's putting them in a situation that's going to create circumstances in which their faith is going to be tested. He wants them, I think this is important to know, he wants them to end up in this storm. And it's important to see the disciples' response when he said, let us go over to the other side. When he said, let's go, what did the disciples do? Why are we going over there, Jesus? That's the side where the Gentiles are. We don't want to go over there. They don't do any of that. All right, let's go. They get in the boat, they follow, they row, and they go. They just obediently get in the boat and do what Jesus told them to do. And then they are in the midst of the storm, and the fear and the anxiety grow until finally they are pushed to the end, and they have nothing left to do but to call out to Jesus and say, Lord, do you not care? I think God had every intention for them to go through the storm and for them to work through it so they would grow in their faith. He didn't protect them from it. He didn't take them around it. He didn't give them just enough that they could handle. He gave them more than they could handle. And what it did was it drew them to the end of themselves, to where they had no other option but to call out, Jesus, help. This is the only option they had left. And he does the same thing in our lives. I think there's a strong misconception and there's bad theology when we think when we come to Jesus, or we place our faith and our trust in Jesus, that if we just have enough faith, if I can muster up strong enough faith and I believe enough, that everything is going to be better. That when I place my faith in Jesus, that my life is going to be perfect now. We must understand that when we faithfully are following Jesus, even in our obedience to him, just like the disciples just did, they got in the boat and they obeyed Jesus and followed him and went to the other side. They did exactly what Jesus told them to do. Even when we are obedient, he will send us through storms that he has authored for our lives. He's not going to protect us from it. He's not going to let us go around it. He's not only going to give us just enough that we can handle on our own, but he's going to bring us to the end of ourselves where we have nothing left to do but to learn to depend on him. And as we're going through those things, we can feel very lonely and we can feel abandoned, just like the disciples did here. But this is where our knowledge and being able to rely on the truth of who Jesus is comes in to take over. Because the Lord of creation is present in our circumstances too. Not only is he the author of our circumstances, but he is present in our circumstances. When we face troubles at home, at work, at school, when you and your wife or your spouse, when you are just not getting along, when it is just constant conflict, when the kids aren't listening, when you have a strained relationship at work, if you're a kid, when you're getting bullied at school, in all of those situations, you can feel incredibly alone and abandoned. When you lose a loved one, when you lose a job and it feels like your whole world is just crashing down around you, you can feel incredibly isolated. In 2012, we were blessed to welcome our 11-year-old. Well, he wasn't 11 at the time. He was 0, but he's 11 now. We were blessed to welcome Easton into the world. Easy, great pregnancy, everything was great. It was just my first experience. Well, to be honest, I didn't really experience it. We found out that Amy was pregnant 2 weeks later. I got shipped off to Fort Benning, and I got home 2 weeks before he was born. So easiest pregnancy of my life for me, I don't see what the big deal is. But easy pregnancy, even for her, was pretty... she'll say how easy of a pregnancy that he was. And I grew up with a brother and a sister. And so and she grew up with a brother. And so we had always imagined that we were going to have multiple kids, like we just wanted, we imagined we'd have the big family. We never like set out to just like have just one kid. We always thought we were going to have more. Well, after Easton, Amy, she struggled with postpartum depression really bad. And I had no idea. I was oblivious. I don't even know, like, at the time, I couldn't even say that I even knew postpartum depression was a thing. Like, if you asked me what depression was, of course, I'd heard of it, but my understanding of it was so flawed that I would have just said it's, like, you're really sad and eventually you'll get over it. Like, that was how I thought of depression. And I definitely had no idea of the effects that it could take on a person. And so one day, as Amy was suffering through this, eventually, as she was still suffering with the postpartum depression, she got pregnant. And so we were getting ready to have our second baby. And then at 10 weeks and 3 days into that pregnancy, she miscarried. And so I remember coming home one day, and she was sitting on the couch, and I worked on second shift at this time, and so I got home, and it was dark. I got off at 10, and so I got home around 10:30, and she's sitting on the couch, and all the lights in the house are off, and I thought, well, this is strange. And so I walk through, and I see her sitting on the couch, just blankly staring at the wall, and I could tell she was crying. And I go over to her, sit down next to her, and eventually she just starts crying again. And then she kind of gains her composure, like, what's going on? And then she looks at me and she says, every day when I'm driving to work, I have to convince myself not to drive into a guardrail. Like, what do you do? How do you respond to that? I so helpless, I didn't know what to do. And so I called my pastor, and because I had no idea what to do. So I called my pastor and said, hey, this is what Amy's going through. This is what she's experiencing. What do I do? And I had a really good pastor at the time. And he said, here's this phone number. Call this phone number tomorrow. We're going to put her in counseling. We'll pay for it. And so like that week, she started seeing a counselor, talking to her. And we started to see some progress. She started talking to a counselor, was doing that regularly. She even had some medication, and started to see some progress being made. After several months of that, third pregnancy, 10 weeks and 3 days, same exact time, miscarried again. All that progress that it seemed like we had made when we were coming out of that season, just big setback. Back into counseling, like starting to see some progress again, miscarried a fourth pregnancy. And it was like I wish I could tell you that I led well in that. Like, I wish I could tell you that my response during that season of life was, babe, we just have to trust that God knows what he is doing here. We can just trust him. He's got a plan for this. We know how he is going to work this out. We just have to have enough faith that God is working in this. That was not my response. My response was the same as the disciples. God, what are you doing? Like, where are you? Like, do you even care what my wife is going through right now? Because that's what suffering does. Suffering, it disrupts our trust. We think God cares, and we even really want to believe he cares, but suffering stretches our ability to see that he cares. But then that's when having a true knowledge of God allows you to fall back on your trust of him, even when you doubt. If you think that when you go through storms and when you go through crises in your life, that it's the strength of your faith that is going to sustain you, you're putting your faith in yourself. It is not the strength of your faith that is going to sustain you. It is the object of your faith. The strength of my faith during that season did not get me through that. But Jesus never left. I can tell you, being 8 years removed from that season, looking back into it, I didn't see it then. And even sometimes, like, it's really hard to see all the ways now, but Jesus was in the boat. Now, 8 years later, we can look back on it and we can see that how he has kind of redeemed that pain. The pain never goes away, and you're never thrilled that you went through seasons like that. But after going through that, we've now had the opportunity to talk to and minister and to care for couples who've experienced similar losses. And it doesn't take the pain away, but you can still look back and you can see the midst of that season, and you can see how God uses it and how God redeems it for his good and for the good of others, and how he grows you through that. So what we're going to do as we close is we learned a new song this morning, Firm Foundation. And we're actually going to sing that song again in closing. And the second verse of that song says, I've still got joy in chaos. I've got peace that makes no sense. I won't be going under. I'm not held by my own strength because I've built my life on Jesus. He's never let me down. He's faithful through every season. So why would he fail now? See, even in the midst of our storms, when we are panicking, when we are feeling alone, when we are doubting, and we question whether or not Jesus is there or if he even cares, as we grow in our knowledge of him, we can take confidence that the Lord over all creation, not only does he author the storms that we go through as a way to grow our strength, but he is present in all of our circumstances and he has total control. It is the object of our faith. It is Jesus. He is the reason that we can have joy in chaos. He is the reason we have peace that makes no sense. It is not our strength, but it is his, and he never fails. So if you're here today and you don't know Jesus, if you know about God, but you don't know him, I pray today that you place your trust in him. And church, we can take confidence that the same God who told the storm to sit down and shut up is the same God who has our entire lives in his hands. Let's pray.